The set 7 meta is firmly upon us. I am absolutely loving it so far, but do you know who's loving it even more? Sapphire Steel players. We have got 3 tournaments to look at: a 17-player event in Germany, around a 40-player event at Battle Bear in Germany, and Southside Gaming in the United States of America with over 100 players. We're going to be looking at a ton of deck lists. We're also at the end of the video going to take a look at the market trends and see what are the best selling cards, and that is courtesy of Card Market, who sponsor my channel. Tamatoa is a €50 legendary at the moment, which is absolutely crazy. And of course, there's also an enchanted of this. I only got 1 Tamatoa in 7 boxes and a trove, which I'm feeling a little bit heartbroken about. It is a very expensive card. Many Sapphire players are playing 4 copies of it. The other bestsellers: Bell, Tamatoa, Mushu. We're going to take a look at all the other bestsellers at the end of the video. Let's start off with the secret rare tournament in Germany. About 17 players, so we're going to skim through these lists and focus on the bigger events. But it was the other set 7 event that I had data for. We can see that Ruby Sapphire finishing in the top 4, with Bell being a new addition, as well as 1 copy of Tamatoa, as well as the Sapphire Coil. We've got a couple of Amethyst Steel decks. This one a pretty aggressive one with the 7 Dwarfs Mine, with Doc, Happy, the Cobra, gathering knowledge and wisdom. The second place one is playing Rabbit, as well as the new Gantu Experienced Enforcer. When you play this character, characters can't exert to sing songs until the start of your next turn, and each player, which includes you, pays 2 ink more to play actions or items. Of course, many of you will have seen my Amethyst Steel deck, which I'll have a full deck guide on coming soon. Make sure you subscribe. And in first place, it was Philip with a really, really awesome looking Amber Steel deck with Bolt. I actually might test some Bolt today. This might have inspired me. Bolt, of course, a dual ink card, super rare. Whenever you play this character, gain 1 lore for each... whenever you ready this character, gain 1 lore for each other undamaged character you have in play. So it's going to be particularly strong if you're able to shift it. Of course, Amber Steel has a lot of really strong cards already, but we did see that Amber Steel Dock decks caught on quite a bit last set. So if you want to go for an Amber Steel Dock setup, the Bolt could be a really nice top end, particularly if you're able to shift it, because you can quest with it immediately and then it readies quite quickly. If you just play Bolt for 5 ink, you're then going to quest with it, and then it's then going to not be until turn 7 that it would ready and trigger its ability. So I think you do need to shift Bolt to be good. And a concern is that the Bolt shift targets aren't that impressive. And Philip goes for the Bolt Headstrong Dog, which is only a 1/3 that quests for 1. Whenever this character quests, if he has no damage, you may draw a card, then choose and discard a card. Probably worse than a card like Cinderella, which is a 2/2, which quests for 1 and draws and discards. Probably worse than Simba, but it's really just there to be a shift target. I think the 5-cost Bolt is pretty good. It is the lack of good shift targets which put me off, but I think it's really nice that Philip has gone for Bolt, and I think if you're playing Bolt, you probably do want to play at least some sort of shift target. So big shout out to Philip, also with the penny in there, taking down this 17-player tournament. Now, let's move on to the big event, starting off with Southside Gaming, which had a total of 138 players. Albert Bedellans, friend of the channel, was the head judge. There is also some streamed footage of this tournament, so if you guys are interested in me watching back some of the tournament gameplay from this event, make sure to subscribe, because that is the plan, to watch some of the gameplay from this event. Now, top 16, we're going to look at all top 16 decks because it was a huge event. Alex Blair on Amethyst Steel has both Doc, Rabbit, and Genie, so a lot of card draw, and that's going to maybe be able to unlock the potential of the Giant Cobra. My concern about the Giant Cobra in some decks is that you don't really have enough card draw to make full use of it, but with this amount of card draw, it should be fine. Obviously, a lot of the time, a big problem with playing Rabbits and Doc and Genie is when you have multiple of those in hand, it can be a bit awkward. But the Giant Cobra gives you a great way of discarding Doc and maybe potentially removing that downside. So I actually like the idea of trying to play all 3 of them. There's also 2 copies of And Then Along Came Zeus, 4 copies of Strength of a Raging Fire, Calhoun, Elsa. The thing is with these decks, it's really hard to fit everything, right? Like you've got 2 Crabs, 1 Benger, 2 White Rose, and what Alex is trying to do here is just cram all of it in by reducing the counts of some things, and I like that approach. Having a flexible way of playing the deck is an interesting way to go. Up next in the top 16, we also have Steve Fernando, who was on Ruby Sapphire. The Sapphire Coil and the Tamatoa are the new cards. In this one, of course, Sapphire Coil. During your turn, whenever a card is put into your Inkwell, you may give chosen character -2 strength this turn. So if you get to the late game with Ruby Sapphire, the Sapphire Coil is going to be incredibly strong, but you might just struggle to contest the early game. Only 1 copy of a Pirate Scythe, only 2 Half Sharks as well, 2 copies of Hideaway, 3 copies of Tamatoa, Happy as a Clam, which is going to be great at getting that lucky dime down on the board for 0 cost if you can quest with Tamatoa. I'm sure there's going to be also Fishbone Quill making a return. Makes sense with Tamatoa to see a return of the Fishbone Quill. Also Tamatoa, Sapphire Coil synergy, being able to play that for free. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more Ruby Sapphire decks to look at. And sure enough, the next one is also Ruby Sapphire. This one playing Bell Apprentice Inventor. I'm definitely going to be testing Ruby Sapphire with the new Dual Ink color Bell, because I think that's a deck which really interests me. You guys know me, I don't tend to love Ruby and Sapphire, but I'm pretty interested at the potential of the Shift Bell, because that card could really pop off. But Half Shark, 4 copies of, I would imagine that's still going to be the best way to play Ruby Sapphire. We know how good Half Shark is from the last set. 2 Pirate Scythe, 2 B Prep, 4 Coil in this one as well. Up next, a very, very cool deck to see. We've actually got, surprisingly, honestly, a Sapphire Amethyst deck. Not many 1-drops, but playing the Porpsicle and playing Bell. So sacrificing the Diablo, sacrificing Magic Brooms to play Porpsicles, which you don't tend to see historically in Amethyst, Sapphire, but it enables that Bell which can contest the board. Nothing really to sing, well actually nothing at all to sing with Bell in this deck. A big advantage of Bell in Ruby Sapphire is that you have a slow start and she can contest the board, and in Sapphire Steel the Bell is able to sing Let the Storm Rage On. But there is the Shift Bell, the Accomplished Mystic, Shift 3, and we know that this Bell was already a pretty strong card, and Sapphire and Amethyst does have a little bit of a lack of control. So being able to shift is interesting. The concern I have about that idea, while it's really cool to see, is shifting onto a card with a 3-3 stat line to have a card with a 4-4 stat line isn't that impressive, right? You actually don't get that much value from shifting Bell. It's a nice idea. I don't think Sapphire Amethyst looks particularly well positioned this set. I don't think it got much. I think the dual ink cards for Sapphire Amethyst are a little bit lackluster, which I have been on record saying I really like Sven. No copies of Sven. And I do still like Sven for what it's worth. But the other 2 or other 3 dual link cards for Sapphire Amethyst, you have like a 1-cost Merlin, which is a bit of a meme. You have a expensive uninkable Elsa, which seems bad. And you have a 4-cost Anna, which is okay. But none of them really setting the world alight, and I think Sapphire Amethyst could have done with some more strong dual ink cards to really push the deck this set. So I imagine that we won't see much Sapphire Amethyst as the set develops. But big shout out to Mikey for putting in some serious work also with that Madam Mim Purple Dragon, the Library, the Hades. Really awesome to see Mikey popping off with Sapphire Amethyst. Up next, we've got Hector Herreras, which is a name which is familiar. I know this is a player that's topped multiple Disney Lorcana challenge events. Sisu, Goofy in there as well. There are 4 copies of the Half Shark as well as 3 copies of Tamatoa. Also playing 2 copies of the Sapphire Coil and going for the legendary Sisu. It is worth noting on a tournament like this, which is focusing on new cards, people are going to be wanting to test the new cards. So just because top players like Hector are playing the Sapphire Coil, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Sapphire Coil is going to prove to be the best way to play the deck down the line. In my meta report video that I posted a few days ago, I suggested and I prophesized that maybe the best way to play these Ruby Sapphire decks is more similar to the Dinkham Famlist with the Hidden Cove, with the Super Goofs, and that might still be the case. It's up for debate, but it definitely makes sense that this early on into a set that people are wanting to experiment with the new cards to really evaluate how good they are. So just because we're seeing top players like Hector playing the Sapphire Coil, it doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the best way as things go. Like if you're ever going to experiment with some set 7 cards, the opening weekend is obviously the time to do that. Like we had Ed on the channel after he won the North American Championships, and I interviewed him, and he mentioned, the first set 7 tournament I played, which was the Battle of the Bay, which I cast, he wanted to check out Half Shark in Ruby Amethyst, and while that didn't end up being the best way, it obviously makes sense to test. So I think that's just a general thing to bear in mind, that when we're looking at these opening deck lists on the first week, you can expect to see a lot of set 7 cards which might not make the cut ultimately, because people want to use this opportunity to experiment. Up next, Dylan in the top 16. Oh, baby. Hello. Maleficent biding her time. Now we're talking. It's a dock setup with the Giant Cobra, with the Merlin Crabs. This is a list I like the look of, but of course I do. There's Maleficent 1-drop in there. Again, a problem with these Amethyst Steel decks is it's so difficult to fit everything in. No genies. You've got a couple of crabs. You've got the Giant Cobra. 2 libraries is also an interesting addition, and 2 copies of Elsa, but I do like the look of this one with the Calhoun and the Maleficents. I think you just need to be able to zoom with purple steel. I do think that the burn decks, which announcement, we're going to be calling those story decks from now on, which I'll talk more about in my upcoming videos about those, but the story decks, previously known as burn decks, which play things like Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, Amethyst Chromicon, I actually think those are going to be the best way to play Amethyst Steel this set. That's what I'm prophesizing, but you can definitely still play Amethyst Steel in a bunch of ways with things like Strength of a Raging Fire, getting you some board control. This deck looks really great, so big shout out to Dylan. I like the look of that one. Sapphire Steel, the first, and I'm sure not going to be the last. Sapphire Steel, a bunch of different ways you can go about building it. You've got a greedy setup potentially with Fishbone Quill and lots of ramp. I honestly like the look of the decks with Alice, which for some reason are known in the community as Kiwi Birds, which I'm not too much of a fan of that name, but this is very much in that vein with Alice. Savvy Sailor being a really strong aggro tool, very difficult to deny it, questing for essentially 3, and it also gives you protection to, for example, your Mr. Smee or your Pluto getting ward can be really very strong indeed. What are the new cards in this one? Well, of course, Belle is in there, being able to sing both Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire. Fortisphere and Porpsicle are good options for Hiram Flavisham. Cogsworth's in there, Benja's in there. Of course, Mulan able to discard your extra copies of Doc, maybe discard a Storm if you don't want to go for it, or an extra copy of Alice. The McDuck Manor's in there. I really like the look of this one. Cogsworth is in there as well to give resist. Of course, good with the Smee, good with the Pluto potentially. It looks like a really strong build. The only thing that I don't like about this deck is the lack of Gantu. But you guys know me, I'm a little bit biased when it comes to Gantu, Captain Crankyhead, that 5 cost character which quests for 4. It's also a captain, which is nice with Smee. It's hard to fit everything. Cogsworth is definitely a strong card. I don't know if I think Cogsworth will end up making the cut in these lists eventually. I think that a deck like this, you kind of just want some questing power, and I'm not sure that Cogsworth really provides that. I think Cogsworth was great in the Whole New World decks because it provides you control while also being a warded character to sing a whole new world. Cogsworth, if Cogsworth's the worst card in your deck, it's probably quite good. If I was to play it personally, I would probably try and put in a Gantu in favor of the Cogsworth, but the rest of the deck pretty much identical to how I would go about it. And Cogsworth is great, no doubt about that, so big shout out to Jake. Into the top 8 now. We have Sapphire Steel from Matthew Red Shorts, and very fascinating to see Simba is preferred over the new Mulan. I'm not convinced about that at all. I think that Mulan is just strictly better than Simba, unless you're playing some form of Shift Simba, or if you're playing Pride Lands, which values having a prince or king character at the location. So I really would avoid playing Simba over Mulan. Why, you might ask? Well, a 2/1 character is just a lot better than a 1/2 as a 1-cost character. A 1/2 character is better into 1/3 characters like Olaf, but cards like Olaf just aren't in the meta, right? Like an Olaf can trade out a Mulan and stay on the board. It cannot take out Simba. But, for example, the Mulan can deal damage to locations. Both get removed by Let the Storm Rage on. There's not that many things that remove characters with 1 willpower. Obviously, Tinkerbell does, but Tinkerbell is a 6-cost character. Mulan is just way better than Simba. So very surprised to see Simba, the card of choice, in here, but interesting to see nonetheless. Maybe they didn't have access to Mulans, but I don't know. They have 3 Tamatoas, so they probably should have access to Mulan. So I definitely don't agree with that. I mean, Simba's not much worse, but it is worse. And I think it is objectively worse in this deck, to be completely honest with you. I think that 1/2 stat line is much, much less appealing, at least to me, than a 2/1 stat line. Calhoun, Docs, me, Alice, Bell, Benja, John Silver. John Silver is still not a card I'm personally convinced by. An idea of John Silver is that it's a bit of a tech for the half shark, because it means that you could play it onto a half shark and the half shark can't challenge during their next turn. So it's definitely nice to have a bit of a tech. I think a couple of John Silvers is reasonable, but perhaps you might just want to try and beat Ruby Sapphire by being a little bit more aggressive with the questing. I'm not sure. I suppose Cogsworth is going to be a really good tech card in the Sapphire Steel mirror matchups as well. So maybe that's a big reason to play Cogsworth at the moment, is because it's a good tech card for mirror matchups. Pete, Hiram, Pluto, very similar list with the Tamatoa in this one, and this one didn't have Tamatoa, and again, maybe that's because they don't have Tamatoa, just like me. That's the other thing to consider on opening week, is players might not have access to certain cards. Amber Emerald in the top 8. This is a deck I'm really fascinated to try out myself. So a big reason to play Amber Emerald is these 2 dual ink cards here, Lady and Tramp, which is quite fitting. Tramp, honestly, much better than I first gave it credit for. For each character card you have in play, you pay 1 ink less to play this character. I think if I click this, it's going to be a bit of a bigger picture. It is. For each character you have in play, you pay 1 ink less to play this character. So if you have 3 characters in play, Tramp costs 4. And when you play this character, you may draw for each other character you have in play, then choose and discard that many cards. Tramp is really good for cycling your deck, finding the good, valuable cards, getting rid of your uninkable cards. And it's also really good for populating your Chernabog. Tramp also allows you to discard a Chernabog if it's going to be awkward. So Tramp plus Chernabog, really strong. Historically, Chernabog, a card you would only play 1 copy of, but now you could probably get away with playing multiple. Lady, who is the star of the show for me, is when you play this character, you may return up to 2 character cards with cost 2 or less from your discard to your hand. Really good at continuing to ink a lot of the time with a deck like Amber and Emerald. In this style, you will run out of card draw unless you play, for example, Clarabelle, which is definitely an option, by the way. But Lady just gives you more cards to do more inking. Also just gives you more cards to just put down on the board for more questing power. Of course, Rapunzel's in there for some more card draw. Interesting to see Dale as well. Dale is when you play this character, you may put the top 3 cards of your deck into your discard to give chosen character -3 strength until the start of your next turn. So it populates your Chernabog. And you could, for example, give your opponents Mr. Smee -3 strength until the start of your next turn, which gives you some more questing power. It's really going to be interesting to see what shell this deck ends up being. Like, there's going to be some things you're always going to play. Like, you're always going to play Lady, Tramp, and Chernabog. But the rest is really up for debate. I think you're always going to play Daisy because you want some aggressive questing power. But do you play Clarabelle? Do you play Pegasus Shift? Do you play Mufasa? Personally, I think I would play Mufasa, by the way. And I've been a bit of a Mufasa hater historically. But for me, if you've got a deck with 60 characters, I think if you're already playing a deck like this, it's like, well, I may as well play Mufasa. I think my criticism of Mufasa historically has been that a lot of people will put Mufasa in their deck and then build the deck around Mufasa. Whereas for me, Mufasa is the card which, if I already have a deck which just wants to play characters, then I just slot Mufasa into it. So I think I would play Mufasa. I actually might play Amber Emerald on my stream today, so you can look out for that in my upcoming meta reports of my favorite versions of the deck. I'm not sure about Dale, while I do like the card. I think Ursula Deceiver makes sense to give you some coverage into things like Be Prepared and those removal cards like Storm Rage On and Strength. Prince Philip is great with Ward. Lilo, I think, is also probably quite good because it also gives you some late game coverage into Ruby Sapphire where they're just removing everything. You can bring the Lilo back and try and finish the job with her. And you definitely need some aggressive questing, things like Daisy. I think Merfolk might be of interest as well. But in this one, very interesting to see Lady. If you have a character named Tramp in play, this character gets +1 lore. So Lady is really strong if you have a Tramp in play, but it is uninkable. And this Tramp is really good. This Tramp is interesting. It's honestly better than I thought it would be. I can definitely see it making the cut. If you have a character named Lady in play, you pay 1 ink less to play this character. And when you play this character, chosen character of yours gets +1 strength this turn for each other character you have in play. That is pretty strong. If you've got 3 other characters in play, you kind of have a mini crab that could cost you just 1. The problem is with this deck, do you really want to be taking challenges or do you just want to be questing left, right, and center? So I think there's a world that the Lady and the Tramp cheaper cards don't end up in the final versions of these decks. But if you're going to play one, you definitely play the other. And it's definitely a very, very reasonable approach. Little John and Nala are both in here because they're very difficult for cards like Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire to remove, and they can get you some questing power. Merryweather is also another card which is quite similar to a crab. Yzma also populates your discard. It's the same card as the Cinderella, which draws and then discards a card, and Donald Duck as a bodyguard with a bit of burn, or actually a bit of story, that's what we're going to call it, story gain, is also an option. Very, very fascinating deck. I think that this is probably the most traditional style of aggro deck which has some legs this set. I think Mufasa wants to come into it personally. I really do. But I am excited to test it myself. I think I'll play it myself today. Big shout out to Paul for an awesome list. Really, really like a lot of the choices here. It's very, very fascinating. Like I say, probably a little bit different to how I would go about it. I think you've got a choice between Rapunzel or maybe Clarabelle. Both are very reasonable options for your card draw. I am really excited to try this deck out myself. Still in the top 8, we've got Jake REB Dreams on Amethyst Steel. Also sticking with a Doc and Genie setup with the Giant Cobra. Again, Doc and Genie and Calhoun all in the same deck previously felt quite clunky, but the Cobra gives you a nice way of discarding a spare Doc or a spare Genie while gaining lore in doing so. Only 3 Brooms makes me sad. That's the one thing I don't like about this deck. No Maleficents is reasonable. Maleficents are going to struggle up against the Steel decks. Calhoun, I think, is great going second. Crab is in there. No sign of the new Jafar, which is also an option. 3 Friends, 4 Strength, 2 Library. I like this setup on the deck quite a bit. No Elsa, also worth mentioning, but I think that Elsa becomes less important because this meta seemingly is going to have less Amethyst decks in general, so you don't need to focus on the mirrors as much, and you need to be teched a little bit more for the Steel decks, the Sapphire Steel and also the Ruby Sapphire. Is this deck going to be quick enough to beat Ruby Sapphire? Maybe, maybe not. Top 8, Emerald Steel. Emerald Steel, also a deck which I expect to do quite well this meta, as shared in my meta report. The real reason is you've got Ruby Sapphire as one obvious deck, which we're used to. You've got the new Sapphire Steel deck, and also the Amber Steel decks are kind of doing similar things, at least the Doc version of Amber Steel, being able to sing Storm and Strength with either Belle or Cinderella. Then you've kind of got like aggro decks being another option. And then the other 4th kind of style of deck, which to me makes sense this meta, is discard. And maybe you've also got a few mid-range decks of like Amethyst Steel. But I think discard, as soon as you've got greedy decks like Sapphire dominating the meta, and you've got less decks like Genie decks and Amber Steel aggro decks, I think discard becomes a natural answer to a lot of these lists. And I think Diablo, when people aren't expecting it, is going to be good. One thing I really don't like about this Diablo deck is no copies of Hidden Cove. Because Storm Rage on and Strength can deal with Diablo quite easily, I think that Hidden Cove is going to be very necessary for Diablo decks to be worth it. But Morph is in there, and the new Pete Space Pirate. I have to say, I did have this card in my Emerald Steel list, but I was not really that convinced by it. But having played against this card, it really impresses me. It is very, very strong. Of course, you can shift it onto Morph, which your Diablo can also shift onto Morph, but you can also shift it onto your Pete. And Pete is good in Emerald Steel anyway, because if you shift your Diablo the same turn you play Pete, they can't remove it, and then you can shift Pete, and while this character is exerted, opposing characters can't exert to sing songs. So maybe you don't need the Hidden Cove for the Diablo. I think this card's really, really good. You could shift your Diablo on turn 3, the same time that you play Pete, and then on turn 4 you shift Pete, and when it's exerted, if your opponent wants to remove your Diablo, they're going to have to hardcast Strength or hardcast Storm. So this card looks great, because it's also worth noting that it is a pirate itself, so when it is exerted, it also gets resist. So it's essentially a 5/5 with resist 1, and if you get multiple of these Petes down, it gives your other Petes resist as well. I underestimated just how good this card is. It is really very strong. It's got resist 1, quest for 2, you can shift it in. Big weakness of Emerald Steel historically is locations and just not having big stats early. Well, Pete gives you big stats early. It gives you another reason to play Morph, which gives you more consistency as well on shifting your Diablo. Benja is an interesting option as well to deal with Amethyst Chromacon, by the way, because I do expect my style of story decks, which we're calling them, traditionally known as burn decks. It's really a problem if you're playing a discard deck, your opponent can just draw a card at the start of their turn. So Benja I actually like as an option. It's obviously good against the Sapphire decks as well. It's hard to fit everything into these lists though, but I like the setup with the Beast. The Lucifer gives you a little bit more discard. No copies of the Muses is interesting to note. Obviously we've seen these Emerald Steel decks play the Muses quite a lot recently, but you know it's difficult to fit cards when you're only playing 2 copies of Mr. Smee, right? Because you need the discard, you need the Diablo. I like the setup overall, I have to say. I think the Pete Space Pirate really is the key to this deck. I think it's got some legs. I really, really do. Big shout out to Kylie in the top 8. I think I said Kyle earlier. Kylie, I am so sorry if I said Kyle. Please forgive me. I suck. Sorry, Kylie. Big shout out to Kylie. Top 4, Ruby Sapphire is Mark. And it is a deck with Tipo Sisu. I'm not going to read every card, but the Half Shark's in there. 4 copies of Happy as a Clam. 3 copies of the Coil, 2 dimes. I think, again, if you're playing the Happy as a Clam, it makes sense to go back to the dimes. Of course, you might also want to go down a route of playing Mukduk Manas and maybe not playing any copies of Tamatoa. I think those are the 2 ways you're going to kind of find these Ruby Sapphire decks going this season. Only 2 copies of How Far I'll Go is a little bit surprising to me. Very, very strong card. Of course, you can shift 6 on the Daring Visitor Sisu in this one. Into the top 3, and we have the man, the myth, the legend. It's Zan Syed, a triple golden Mickey winner, which is quite a title, and he's playing Oswald. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. During your turn, whenever a card is put into your Inkwell, you may reveal the top card of your deck. If it's an item card, you may play that item for free, and it enters play exerted. Otherwise, put it on the bottom of your deck. Oswald is a card which was basically revealed in set 5 because of the D23 set, and everyone thought, oh my god, this card's going to be insane. It didn't catch on last set, so why is it suddenly catching on now? Because if you actually look, there's no new items here. Well, the reason Oswald is catching on is because there's also this card now. Now, I predicted that this is the best legendary of the set. It was a bit controversial because I think Happy as a Clam is arguably better, but Scrooge McDuck is insane. The big problem that Scrooge McDuck has is that there aren't actually that many good items, which is why you see Zan's list playing a lot of pretty bad cards, right? Like the Shield of Arendelle is not a very good card. I mean, to be fair, he doesn't have that many bad cards, but he doesn't have that many items. I'm sure Zan would actually like to play more items, because there was a clip where his Oswald missed like 8 times in a row. There's 8, 12, 10, only 15 items, which is not going to hit very often, right? 1/4 of Zan's deck are items, which means that 1 in 4 times, roughly, that you ink with an Oswald down is how often you're going to hit an item, which isn't very often. And then the Scrooge McDuck looks at the top 4. So that's about roughly ballpark 67% hit rate, if I'm not mistaken, on Scrooge McDuck hitting an item. But obviously you can increase the odds of Scrooge McDuck and Oswald hitting based off what you mulligan. Like, you're probably going to be mulliganing your items away, for example. I'm sure Zan would probably like to play more items. The problem is that there aren't that many good ones. So I think the more item cards we get in Disney Lorcana, the better Scrooge and Oswald will become. But Zan has decided that these cards are so strong right now that it's even worth playing them without a ton of items. Scrooge McDuck, you can also exert it to play an item, to play him for free. You can exert 4 items. So obviously the Maurice's Workshop, basically every item outside of the dime and the fishbone quill, you don't care about exerting. So if you have 4 items, just getting to play a 4-cost character, which might draw you a card for free, is pretty insane. And obviously if you've got a bunch of Oswalds and you've got a fishbone quill down on the board, you can draw an awful lot of cards potentially, or get to play a lot of items for free with Oswald. And if you hit the Holy Grail with a lucky dime on top, then you can just high roll your way to victory. Belle's in there, of course, with Storm and Strength. No surprises there. Only 3 copies of Tipo and no copies of Sail the Azure at Sea. That is very interesting to see. There is Fishbone Quill instead as the ramp tool, which obviously makes sense with the higher focus on items, and with a high focus on items, 4 copies of both Tama Toas. 3 copies of Zeus can be sung by Scrooge, can be sung by Hiram. Very fascinating deck by Zan. My concern about Oswald is that in mirror matchups, it's probably going to struggle, right? Like, it's going to get removed by your opponent's Storm and Strength. And as much as I love the Scrooge McDuck, it does incentivize you to play a lot of bad items. So I think that there's going to be a couple of versions of this. There's going to be an item version. There's going to be an aggro version. There's going to be maybe a Fishbone Quill Whole New World version. It's going to be really interesting to see the different setups for Sapphire Steel and which one proves to be the best. I have to say, I still like the look of Alice versions that are a little bit more aggressive, but maybe those decks aren't going to be as good in the mirror. Ruby Sapphire is second place, and it's Jonathan Williams. Remember, this was like 138 players, and oh my days, Scrooge McDuck. I didn't expect to see Scrooge McDuck, and Belle's in there as well. Okay, hello. This makes me very excited. Big shout out to Jonathan Williams. So we already looked at Scrooge. What does Belle do? Belle is shift 7, but for each item card in your discard, you pay 1 ink less to play this character using her shift ability. Whenever this character quests, you may put up to 3 item cards from your discard on the bottom of your deck to gain 1 lore. This card is nuts. I played against it yesterday, and it just quested for 6 out of nowhere, and I couldn't believe it. It is really very strong. But I think a key card to enable this is the unconventional tool. But bear in mind, the Belle, you get a foil version in the starter deck, and you also get, I think, some copies of an unconventional tool, and you get the 3-cost Belle. The starter decks this set are really good. I'm honestly very impressed, because the other starter deck, you get the 3-cost Jafar, and maybe it's just the 3-cost Jafar. Oh, and you get like the Honeymoon. I think you get This Is My Family, and you get something else. Anyway, unconventional tool. When this item is banished, you pay 2 ink less for the next item you play this turn. I think this card's really good because you can banish the unconventional tool, and for like 1 ink, you can play Maurice's Workshop. You can play Sapphire Coil for nothing, or Fishbone Quill for 1 ink as well. So it's really cool to see these item builds. We've seen them do well before. Remember, an item build of Ruby Sapphire won a Disney Lorcana challenge. I think it was Birmingham. I think it was Birmingham, which might have been the Ruby Sapphire item deck. It was Ely from France who won. That was using the Queen with the Maurice's Workshop, the Fishbone Quill. So it's so cool to see Jonathan Williams playing a version of Sapphire Ruby with Bell. Like, a lot of people, when they saw this Bell, were like, okay, well, that's not going to see any play. But suddenly, you add Scrooge McDuck in. 4 Tamatoas is what's putting me off trying this myself, because I only have one of these. But very, very fascinating to see this deck perform so well. Obviously, Bell shifting it in, not shifting it in, but playing it in early gives you some early board presence, but then being able to shift it in really allows you to turn on the heat and apply some pressure. That is so cool to see Jonathan Williams pop off with an item setup of Ruby Sapphire at such a big event. But the top deck of the tournament, it is an item meta. It's Jeremy, and it's very similar to Zan's deck. Possibly they got the list from Zan, I don't know. It's almost identical. The thing I'm noticing is there's only 2 T-pos. Zan had 3. And I don't know exactly the difference here. 1 extra copy of Maurice's Workshop. Only 2 T-pos, so like basically not even valuing ramp on too much at all because you have Fishbone. I wonder if T-po's even worth it at all then. Very, very fascinating. So we already looked at this list, but you can see items, the top 3 decks of the tournament. It is an item meta, and that is why Tamatoa is worth so much money. But on to the top 8 of Battle Bear. Big shout out to my friends at Battle Bear. 44 players. Very, very strong community there at Battle Bear in Germany. I was there a few weeks ago. It's a massive store. Sapphire Steel, and it is an Alice version, also playing Doc and Hiram. Bagheera, a card in this one. During an opponent's turn, whenever this character is banished, deal 2 damage to each opposing character. Very, very cool. Tamatoa happy as a clam in this one. Scrooge McDuck in his, and the mana are there as well. Pretty similar to the other lists we were looking at. Into another top 8 deck, and it's another Sapphire Steel deck. But this one's got some interesting things. It's got a Duel Link card, Lady Cluck, a 2/7 bodyguard with ward. Going to be really bad against Ruby Sapphire, but I imagine very strong in the mirror. So that is a very interesting tech option for the mirror. There is also Tinkerbell, which I think Tinkerbell might end up catching on in Sapphire Steel with the Fishbone Quill, because you can play Fishbone Quill on 3, and then suddenly you've got a Tinkerbell on turn 4. That's going to be good against the onslaught of aggro decks. But this one is playing a whole new world. It is playing Fishbone Quill. Lady Cluck, then, a good card to sing a whole new world with in a similar way to Cogsworth, as I mentioned before. And also Arthur in the mix. When you play this character, chosen character gains Challenger 2 and Resist 2 and can challenge ready characters this turn. Very, very fascinating. Still got the Storm. No copies of Strength, despite having Bell, which I'm a little bit surprised by, to be honest. I think if you're playing Bell, Strength of Raging Fire seems a bit too good not to play. But a very, very fascinating list from Hetty. Ruby Sapphire up next. This has got Tremaine. It's got McDuck Manners and Maui Half Sharks. Kind of similar to Dinkham Fam's list, this one, but with a few differences with the Tremaine and the Medusa. Not a single set 7 card in this one, but it's very similar to the list, which kind of probably the best deck from the previous set when the dust settled. Basically, they've cut 2 Vision to fit Lady Tremaine and Madame Medusa. Ruby Amethyst in the top 8, which I did not expect to see. Big shout out to Lakers. They are rocking the new Queen legendary card. You can exert it and choose 3 cards from opponent's discard and put them on the bottom of their deck to gain 3 lore, essentially questing for 3 and denying item recursion with Tamatoa. If any princess cards were moved this way, gain 4 lore instead. There's Belle. There's the new Hades, which is when you play this character, you may deal 2 damage to another chosen character of yours to banish chosen character of cost 3 or less. Beaking, Undisputed, B-Prep, and the Library. Kind of, and Raj is in there as well, and Cusco. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Ed's Disney Lorcana Challenge North American Championship win with the Tremaines and the Libraries and the B-Preps, and also 2 copies of B-King. It does have Library as well, pretty interesting deck. I can definitely see Ruby Amethyst, if it's going to work this set. Of course, you could go for a more aggro setup, maybe with the story gain cards, the burn cards, as we previously called them. But I can definitely see if Ruby Amethyst is going to carve out a home in this metagame, which it usually does, it being more similar to this kind of library control deck, which we saw Ed win the North American Championships with. It'll be interesting to see. In the top 4, we have another Sapphire Steel deck, this one with 1 copy of Captain Hook, 1 copy of Anna, who quest for 2 if you have another hero in play. You've got Alice, John Silver, very similar to the other list. This one does have Captain Cranky Head. It does have 2 copies of the 4-cost Scrooge, and it has 3 copies of the McDuck Manor. Into the top 4, well, that last deck was top 4, we have another Amethyst Steel deck with Doc, Calhoun, Rabbits, and the Cobras. White Roses in there, Zeus and Library as well. We've got Artabax not playing Emerald Amethyst, doesn't fancy it, and I can't say I blame him, going over to the Sapphire Steel. He likes to win. Big shout out to Artabax getting second place. Captain Hook in there obviously can protect your SME, but doesn't quest for much, or probably won't quest at all. Lawrence in there, and also Grammatala. Quite a different setup to some of the other lists that we've seen. Only 3 Storms. I personally, if I'm playing Bell, would play 4 Storms. But it is obviously uninkable, so I can see the logic of playing just 3 for that reason. 3 copies of Zeus. That's going to be nice to sing with the Tala, with the Hiram, and going for Cogsworth instead of the Gantu. And finally, the winning deck from the Battle Bear tournament is also Sapphire Steel, but this one with Alice, which is interesting. This one also with Alice. There was no Alice in Artabax's list. I think Alice is great. I personally would play Alice, and it's got the Gantu in there. This is quite similar to how I would play it. Also only 3 Storm, which I find interesting. I'm not sure about this Gantu, but it's an interesting option as a one-of. When you play this character, characters can't exert to sing songs until the start of your next turn, and each player pays 2 ink more to play actions or items. Kind of similar to Pete. It is uninkable. I'm not too convinced by this card, but it's definitely a very, very interesting one to see if it can find the right home. I think if you're ever going to play it, like 1 copy of it kind of makes sense. 2 at most, because of the uninkable nature. Very, very interesting to see. Gantu's in there, which makes me happy. Big shout out to Pew. Big shout out to Battle Bear and Southside Gaming for hosting these huge events. Thanks to Inkdex for sharing them. Let's take a look at the market thanks to the channel sponsor Card Market, and see what the market's doing, what the best sellers are, because that also gives us a read of not what just the best performing decks are, but also what decks people are most excited to be playing and experimenting with. So Tamatoa, Happy as a Clam Enchanted, is honestly cheaper than I expected. A French version is about 170 euros, and if you want one in English, you're looking at 225 euros, which is about $220. I actually don't know the exact. Euros and dollar are very, very similar, so in case you're wondering on that. But let's look at all the best sellers. So Bell is the best seller, then Tamatoa and Mushu in 3rd. The Giant Cobra in 4th, which is also in the starter deck, which is why it's so cheap. Bell also in the starter deck. Great choice by Ravensburger to put 3 copies of Bell and 3 copies of the Cobra in the starter decks. I really, really am happy to see that. You've also got Scrooge McDuck as a bit bestseller, Mulan, Sapphire Coil, which I don't think it might be in the starter deck actually, I don't know. And then Oswald, the highest selling card from a previous set, is at 15 euros, in large part thanks to Zan popularizing it. This Mulan being so high on the sellers surprises me, if I'm honest. I don't think this Mulan card is very good. Of course, I can see that people are excited to play Ruby Steel, which is great, but a Shift 5 that costs 7 is very, very difficult to achieve. Whenever this character challenges another character, your characters gain. This character can challenge ready characters. I think if I'm playing a Shift Mulan, I'm playing the 6 cost, which can deal a bunch of damage to lots of things, and not this one. Obviously, I understand the Mushu synergy, but I'm pretty unconvinced by that card. I'm surprised to see it so high up. I'm surprised to see this Gantu so high up as well, if I'm honest. Pete Space Pirate, I'm not surprised. Ink Gazer and Hero Hamada, I think it's cool to see, as well as the Baymax. This is my family. Alice Savvy Sailor, also a card from a previous set. Farzo, again, people were excited to play Ruby Steel Challenge decks. Not sure that Farzo is going to make the final cut in those lists. Bolt's up there. All is found, I'm really surprised by, because I don't know what on earth deck you would actually play this card in. I guess people just really like the artwork. I'm really surprised to see that as a bestseller, but maybe people really liking the artwork on that card because it is a banger. Honey Marin, Bagheera, I'm also surprised to see as a bestseller. I imagine this card will go down in price as time goes on, but maybe it ends up making the cut in Sapphire Steel. It doesn't seem too bad in an aggro Sapphire Steel deck. So Bagheera, definitely a card to keep an eye on. I was expecting Lady to be higher. I think Isabella is absolutely a card with meta potential. Tramp's great. Hiram's still up there doing his thing. A bit of an ever-present. We've got Queen. We've got some puppy decks. People are interested to play. I'm going to have to try a puppy deck soon. Spoiler alert, they're going to suck, unfortunately. The puppy payoff cards are pretty damn good. The problem is the puppy cards are terrible. We've got Jafar, which I love this card. Maurice's Workshop and Bell, quite high up. The Tramp, the Jafar, the Calhoun, the Lucky Puppy, the Troubadour, the Queen of Farts, the first sign of Ruby Emerald. I'm definitely interested in trying a Ruby Emerald deck with Queen of Hearts and Mad Hatter. Li Shang, show me more. This card is pretty interesting in the story gain decks, also known previously as burn decks, because you can just draw cards and then play like Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, but also potentially in Amethyst Mill decks. You got Raja, this is the Family Magic Owl, Iago, Conventional Tour, Restoring the Crown, Aurora, Lucky Die, Baymax, this card's terrible. Elsa, this card has a misprint on the foil, where there's like a shadow effect on the foil. You got Mirabelle, Shere Khan, Snow White. I think this card, guys, keep your eye out for this card. I got a lot of faith in it. I think it might be good. Strength, Tamatoa, Thunderbolt, Anna Baloo, Penny Whole New World, Donald Duck Hero, Mickey Mouse, Devil's Eye Diamond. What? This is terrible. I think Glass Slipper, Lady Clark, Return of Hercules, Merlin, Sail Pete, Fishbone Pete, Kanai Goofy, Mad Hatter Pascal, Mirabelle Smee, Fortisphere Kida, Queen of Hearts Donald, Ratigan, Yokai, Cogsworth, Tremaine, King of Hearts, Maneuvers, Cinderella, Aladdin, Kronk, Let It Go. Restoring Atlantis, Pepper, John Silver, Hades, King Canny, and then on came Zeus Bolt, and we've got company. Big shout out to Card Market for the awesome data. Big shout out to all the tournament organizers and Ink Decks for having this data. And of course, a big shout out to all the players for the spicy lists. If you enjoyed the video and watched it this far, please do give it a like and make sure you subscribe. Check out my Metafy page below. I'm also going to be making a Patreon and YouTube members. Please let me know what value I can provide you guys, because at the moment, little bit of a talk while we're this far into the video, there's a bit of a theme of people releasing deck guides in the community behind a paywall. I don't want to do that, but I want to therefore provide value for you guys where you can support me, and I keep everything free, but don't feel bad that I look at other people making loads of money off deck guides and think, I could do that too. I want to keep all my content free, all my deck guides free, but I do want to find some ways to allow you guys to support me and get all my content for free and keep everything free. So I'm definitely exploring ways I can improve, like the YouTube members, the Patreon, the Metafy, all that sort of stuff. I've revamped a bit, but I really want to now push on with that and come up with ways I can really support you guys and give you guys cool ways to support me, which will then enable me to keep everything free. And yeah, just a little bit of a heads up. So thanks for supporting me. I really appreciate you. Watching this far is a great way of supporting me. It's all I could possibly ask for. And see you on the next video. There's so much set 7 content. I love this set. I really, really do.